So welcome. Wow, there's 55 people in this chat. That's really, really exciting. We're really glad that you have taken time to be with us today. My name is Yasmin. I use she or they pronouns, and I am the new host and facilitation lead here at CKX. We're really, looking forward. We've been looking forward to this session. I think it's coming at a really important time. And before we start, I just really wanted to acknowledge what's going on in the world. We've seen in the last 2 months, especially, just a lot of heaviness with the pandemic, as well as like anti-Black racism, transphobia, and like state violence that, I don't want to minimize that grief. And I want to be honest and like share that I've been feeling that, and I think a lot of the hosting team has been feeling that, and I'm sure you've been feeling that. So just really grateful for everyone to take the time to be with us today. Because this is important work, and I think it's exciting that we're able to do this again at such a heavy time. So thank you. To begin, I thought it would be great. I'll stop sharing my screen for a second. To start with a land story. This is something that we've been working on here at CKX, and something I've been doing a lot in community. And that's just a way for us to kind of remember the purpose of what land acknowledgements are. I think for a really long time, land acknowledgements have been a really great introduction, but they've also become performative, and something we're seeing as just something that we have to do and get over with. And we really want to take the time to acknowledge that performance is violent, especially due to the history and why we're doing it. So as a way to kind of like slow down and actually take the time to recognize where we are and how we got here, be it if we're uninvited guests or we are of the traditional territories. We do a land story, and that kind of will be a journey of how the person hosting got here. So that will be me, and so I'll be sharing with you my own story. So I invite you to kind of take a moment and remove all distractions, and just really take this time to connect to where you are and how you got here. So growing up, I knew I was Black, and I am proud to be living within my brown skin and kinky hair. And I think many folks often think of Black folks as a monolith, as a homogenous race of people who experience the world the same. So to kind of break up that narrative a bit, I wanted to walk us through 2 experiences in which my ancestors and my family have in regards to being guests on this land. So I was born to a mother who was also born in so-called Canada, with ancestry in St. Kitts, which is in the Caribbean. Here on Turtle Island, there are about 400,000 African peoples who were brought over and kidnapped to be enslaved. But in the Caribbean, there were over 1.5 million African peoples brought over to be enslaved. And I think that's a really interesting distinction, because I think when we think of like the slave trade and that violence, we often acknowledge, again, like what's happened here and on Turtle Island, which is really important. But I think it's also important to acknowledge the ways in which this slave trade has affected other places and has been incredibly violent in these other places as well. On my father's ancestral roots, he was born in Ethiopia, or as is traditionally known as Abyssinia, and is one of 2 out of the 54 recognized countries in Africa that has never been colonized. The other one is Liberia. And I think that's a really interesting and an important thing to emphasize, that out of the 54 countries, 52 have been colonized. And that kind of shows you that history there and how deep rooted that is. So when he eventually immigrated to so-called Canada in 1987 and met my mom in 1989, is the reason why. and of course, my identity and
Hey, yes, I think we might be experiencing a bit of lag. I don't know if people can just let us know in the chat if you're also experiencing the lag just for a second.
Back to normal.
Okay, great. I think Yaz, you're back. We lost you right at the point where you were going to reveal the big surprise about your parents. So
maybe okay. So I was just saying that, yeah, they met in 1987 and then decided to, met in 1989, and then that's the reason my dad stayed. And so they're both here as uninvited guests because they are first and second generation Canadian settlers. And so I really want to acknowledge that even though I'm a Black person, because of the history of my family and how we got here, it doesn't negate the fact that I am still occupying on stolen land. And it is important to acknowledge that, but it's also important to acknowledge that the transatlantic slave trade did happen in so-called Canada. And so there are Black folks here whose ancestors were kidnapped and brought here against their will. And thus, it's really important, vitally important, that we talk about the displacement of Black people when we discuss the history of colonialism in Canada. And thus, there are so many intersections between Blackness and Indigenous folks and the settlement of this Turtle Island. So I was born in Toronto, Canada, or so-called Toronto, Canada, which is on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat Mississaugas, the Credit First Nation, and it's now home to many First Nations and Métis people and Inuit people, recorded and unrecorded, who continue to take care of this land. So please feel free to use the chat feature to introduce yourselves to other participants, and perhaps you share your name, pronouns, where you're joining us from today, and if you know the traditional territories, please share. And yeah, let's use this time to really just connect and see where we're all coming from and rooted in, and to get to know the lands that we're on better. So as we do that, and I'm seeing some things pop up in the chat, I want to also say that today we're sharing in a fluidly bilingual way, switching occasionally between French and English. So please feel free to engage in either language. We'll translate as needed. And while we're getting started, if you want to update your screen name, if it is currently not displayed, and if you're bilingual or francophone, please, you can add a B or an F suffix to your name so we can flag you in the session and know. And this might be helpful, especially during like breakouts or smaller group discussions. So yeah, allons-y. So that's been a lot of talking from me, but I just wanted to introduce the rest of the hosting team today because I'm really grateful for them and just feeling super supported. So my colleague Lee, if you want to wave, thanks, was here with us today and will be co-hosting the session with me, and will be helping with wayfinding and sending all the links. So look out for those. Really grateful for that. Then we have some really stellar guests with us. So we have Vic Rodney, who's a community organizer and equity commissioner at the University of Waterloo. We have Cass Schwab, who is part of the Queensnell Pride Society, the president of it, and youth and project lead on the project LGBTQ plus community support, and an RBC Future Launch Community Challenge project. And then we have Hannah McGretchy, who's the executive director at 10 Oaks Project, which is an Ottawa-based organization that delivers summer camp and year-round programs to children, youth, and families from LGBTQ plus communities. So welcome, Vic, Cass, and Hannah. Woo, if you guys want to wave. Yay, cool. And then also wanted to welcome my colleague Alexander, who will be our point person for active listening and witnessing. Like I said at the beginning of the session, this is a heavy time, and like working through anti-oppression during this time can be really difficult and will be affecting each of us differently. So if you at any point need to talk to someone individually, you can directly message Alexander, and he's also able to set up a break room and hold space for you to individually express. And also want to flag, although Alexander is not a counselor or a social worker, he's a community member dedicated to care and holds space really beautifully. And we'll hold this session, we'll hold space during our session to listen if you need to check in. So yeah, that's our hosting team. Again, super grateful for everyone. And the last thing before we kind of dive into the content is just wanted to do our community agreements. So we'll be doing this again in English and French. So I'll read out and share my screen to have that displayed. So one moment. Cool. Okay, so these are our community agreements. I just really want to again acknowledge that because this is a heavier session and we're looking at oppression, I really invite you to really take a moment and take and hold these community agreements, because they're really important for creating care in our sessions and making sure these flow well, and trying to avoid harm. So yeah, community agreements, as you can see, represent a consensus on what every person in the group needs from each other and commits to each other in order to feel safe, supported, open, productive, and trusting. As we enter into a dialogue and relationship with each other through YPC, we propose the following guiding principles for our time together to be reviewed and amended as needed to the start of each session. So if there's anything we'd like to add, please name that. So the first is we are accountable to working in the spirit of reconciliation and decolonization and exploring what it means to for each of us. The second is we use people's pronouns. The third is all of our experiences, ideas, and intelligences are valuable and welcome. Fourth is we remember our lived experiences are different and acknowledge that we have different experiences from others. We speak from I and clarify the we. The fifth is we honor stories. When we hear a story, we are being trusted to hold it and not share it unless explicit permission is given. 6 is we do not demand knowledge from others or answers to our questions, but enter into a relationship and confirm that someone is the person to ask and is comfortable answering. We respect their no. And that's a really big one, especially for this session, especially for the breakouts. And the 7th is oops and ouch. So we acknowledge our mistakes and take steps to make it right. We make room for others to acknowledge if they've been hurt or affected by our actions or words. So I'll turn it over to Lee to go over that in French for us.
Merci, Yaz. Bonjour tout le monde. Comme on a dit au début, on vous invite à participer soit en français ou en anglais. La plupart de nos participants aujourd'hui sont anglophones, mais quand même, on aimerait vous offrir la chance de participer en français, soit dans le en texte avec le chat ou aussi en dialogue. Je suis prêt à faire la traduction pour le groupe entre le français et l'anglais. Ensuite, encore, nos ententes mutuelles au sein de la communauté. Premièrement, c'est notre responsabilité de travailler dans un esprit de réconciliation et de décolonisation et d'explorer ce que cela signifie pour chacun et chacune de nous dans le groupe. Nous utilisons les pronoms correspondant aux personnes. Si vous désirez qu'on vous désigne par un pronom neutre de point de vue de sexe, s'il vous plaît, de mentionner ou le nommer avec le nom de votre profil en ligne. Toutes nos expériences, idées et informations sont précieuses et bienvenues. Nous n'oublions pas que chaque personne du groupe a un vécu qui est différent de celui des autres. En disant « je », nous parlons dans notre propre nom et nous expliquons qu'est-ce que nous voulons dire lorsque nous utilisons le pronom « nous ». Nous honorons les histoires. Lorsque nous entendons une histoire, on nous fait confiance que nous le garderons pour nous sans la partager, à moins d'avoir reçu l'autorisation explicite de le faire. C'est très important aussi, en particulier pour la séance aujourd'hui sur l'anti-oppression. Nous n'exigeons pas que les autres partagent leurs connaissances ou répondent à nos questions, mais nous entrons en contact envers confirmer que la personne à qui nous adressons est bien celle à qui la question doit être posée et que cette personne est à l'aise de répondre. On respecte toujours son refus. Et dernièrement, on travaille dans le concept de oups et oui, ou dans une tendance de même. Nous reconnaissons nos erreurs et nous nous efforçons de les réparer. Nous permettons aux autres de s'exprimer et si nous avons les blessés ou affectés par nos actions ou nos paroles. Alors, merci pour ça encore. Veuillez participer soit en français ou en anglais, puis je retourne à Yasmine pour faire la traduction de nos invités. Back to you, Yas.
Oh, you're muted, Yas.
Sorry. Classic. So I said, thank you, Lee, merci. And we're going to continue and actually get into why everyone's here and like what we've been hoping to work through today, which is what is anti-oppression work. So I'm just going to make this full screen so everyone can see it. Awesome. Okay, so yeah, what is anti-oppression work? I think this seems like it might be straightforward, but when you really start to think about it, it's a really broad term. And there's a lot of different frameworks where you could come at this from. So this is a framework and some tools that we'll be sharing with you today. I again want to preface saying that obviously in this one session, we're not going to get through the entirety of what anti-oppression is, especially because it is ongoing and ever changing. But we're hoping that we can share with you some really grounded and foundational tools to help work through anti-oppression work. So yeah, an anti-oppression framework is a tool to see how people experience oppression in the world and the way for us to stop it. This information I'll be sharing to you in this next section was adapted from a really beautiful article by Deb Singh called The 5 W's and H's of Anti-Oppression Frameworks, which is linked in a resource list that we'll be sharing with you later. So before we get into, again, what anti-oppression is, I thought it'd be good to kind of start with what oppression is, because we can't really talk about anti-oppression without knowing what oppression is. So oppression refers to the injustices, be they systemic, using physical, psychological, social, or economic threats or force, microaggressions, and frequently using explicit ideology or sanction against marginalized groups in their everyday interactions by members of dominant groups. Marginalized groups usually lack avenues to express reaction to disrespect, inequality, injustice, inequity, violence, and lack of response to their situation by individuals and institutions can make to make these improvements. So oppression is something that I think Bell Hooks really puts really well and simple, which is being oppressed means the absence of choices. To me, that was a really clarifying way to kind of start understanding. I think it's also really important to acknowledge that oppression has intersections, and there are a lot of us who have oppression or face oppression in parts of our identities, and then also face privilege in the others. So it's really something I wanted to hold. And then we'll also go through a few other key concepts before we get into it, because I think, yeah, again, will be helpful for foundation work. So the next is identity. So again, something that seems like it should be obvious, but it's good to kind of have on the same page. So identity may be defined as a distinctive characteristic belonging to any given individual or shared by all members of a particular social category or group. The next one is privilege. So privilege is the experience of freedoms or rights or benefits, advantages, access, or opportunities afforded to members of a dominant group in society or in a given context. Usually it's unrecognized and taken for granted by members of the majority group, while the same freedoms, rights, benefits, advantages, access, and opportunities are denied to members of minority or disadvantaged groups. And the last term I thought would be helpful for shaping this conversation would be power. Again, seems very obvious, but yeah, there's a lot of ways it can be understood. So in this context, we're understanding power as that which allows one group to name and classify and subordinate groups and subject them to differential treatment. So yeah, those are some key concepts. And again, all of this will be linked in the resource list if you want to go back to them. So let's get into what anti-oppression is. So again, anti-oppression is a way of thinking about the world as well as a tool to use to see the world. Anti-oppression is a tool to understand and respond to the experiences of oppression. So anti-oppression can be also seen as a way of identifying and naming and combating the oppression that happens against certain people based on their identities, factors such as race, gender, sexuality, ability, religion, class, status, body size, and more. That list goes on. The goal of anti-oppression work is to be able to move toward ending that mistreatment, harm, and violence. Of course, like I said earlier in one session, we aren't going to be able to end oppression as much as I wish that were possible. But again, I think it's really important that we start using these frameworks, principles, and practices as a way to kind of start doing the work and showing up. So last thing of this section is who is affected by oppression and anti-oppression. So oppression affects everyone differently, like I said. Anti-oppression work may be done by everyone, those who experience oppression and those who experience privilege, and it should be done by both groups, which means that we all should be engaging in anti-oppression work at some point or another, or maybe always. However, when it comes to the ways in which we show up in anti-oppression work, it's very important to name that due to our positionalities, this work can be a lot more emotionally laborious for those who face systemic deep roots of oppression. We know that racism exists, but it's extremely important to name the ways in which Black peoples experience racism in a specific and violent way. When talking about racism that affects Black people, it's important to specifically name that as anti-Black racism. We also know that homophobia exists, but when it comes to trans people, it's really important that we name that as transphobia because there is this difference in what that looks like. And then when we think about the intersections of identity, and we're thinking, for example, of a Black trans woman, we know that they are facing both anti-Black racism as well as transphobia, as well as sexism, neglect and harm from the health system, and a bunch of other really deep-rooted oppressions. So it's important to really recognize these intersections and the ways in which they show up in all of us. So now that we have a bit of framework, the next thing is how do we integrate anti-oppression into our everyday lives? It's one thing to know what it is, it's another to kind of start actualizing it and using it. So we've kind of compiled a list of principles and practices, and this will again be in the resources so you can look to it. But yeah, so we'll go over that. So principles and practices. On the right side of your screen, you'll also see it in French. But the first one that I think is important to name is don't center yourself or your privilege. So again, a lot of us are coming at this with privilege in different regards in our identities. And when we're thinking about showing up for folks and combating oppression, it's really important that we listen to the groups that are facing oppression in that context. It's not really about how you feel about it. It's more so about how they are experiencing it. And we want to believe their experience, because by not believing it and centering our own beliefs, we're continuing to do that systemic harm. The second is to take responsibility for our prejudices and actions which perpetuate oppression. I think no one wants to be a bad person. The fact that you're all here means that you want to be better and you want to continue to do this work. But by doing that, it's really important that we take responsibility for times in which we do harm. I think, again, sometimes it doesn't come from an intentional place, but that intention doesn't negate harm. So it's really important to be able to name that within yourself and take responsibility for it. The next one is challenging supremacist practices. This is, again, just making sure that we're actively trying to unlearn and challenge the structures and systems that we have been conditioned to believe are true and have always been true. The next is take active responsibility for initiating, volunteering, and following through with this work. So again, I think it's awesome that we're all here today, and it's really important. And I think some of us have probably done other anti-oppression or anti-racism or solidarity workshops. But it's really important that we actively do this throughout our lives. There's a quote by Angela Davis where she just says, in a racist society, it's not enough to be not racist. You have to be actively, and so that just means integrating this into your everyday life and voluntarily following through in this work. The next is understand that you will feel discomfort and pain as you face your part in oppression, and realize that this is necessary. This is a necessary part of the process of liberation and growth. So again, I think we will all come at this differently, but when we recognize the ways in which we may be oppressing others because we're complicit in certain systems and structures, it can feel really uncomfortable. It can feel really like awful, and like you feel like all the shame. But again, it's really important that we take that and we use it as a way to kind of push forward. What's most important is that we're trying to dismantle these structures. And when we kind of recognize that feeling of shame or discomfort or pain, that's the first step in being able to start challenging those supremacist structures, like we said earlier. And then the next is we must support each other and be gentle with each other in this process. I said this recently on a different panel, but none of us have lived in the world that we're actively fighting towards. None of us have lived in the just futures that we want to see. So that means there are going to be mistakes along the way, but we also need to hold each other accountable, but also hold each other along that journey. We need to be kind to ourselves and with each other in order to be able to make this this movement irresistible and make it something that we can be sustained. And then the last one I'll share is be conscious and committed to understanding how white supremacy, patriarchy, classism, heterosexualism, and other systems of oppression affect each one of us. So again, just really recognizing the ways in which there are ways in which we can be privileged and there are ways in which we can be marginalized, and really taking in those intersections and taking that and holding that and being kind to yourself, but also recognizing the ways in which in certain contexts you'll show up as more privileged, in other contexts you might not. So yeah, those are some of the integrated ways to show up and do this anti-oppression work. I've been talking for quite some time, so I'm really excited to now welcome in our guests to share. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Yeah, really excited to welcome in our guests to share their own journeys on anti-oppression work and how they've been doing this. So I'll invite Vic to start us off, and you can introduce yourself a bit, and then yeah, get into it. Thanks, Vic. Oh, and you're muted.
No, I got the notification. So where to start? So I'm a young Black organizer, kind of got into organizing by accident. It really started when I moved from a very white neighborhood called Stouffville, which is just north of Markham in the GTA. And so I lived there. I had a very rude awakening when I immigrated from Jamaica and saw that there was no one that really looked like me, or that I was just used to seeing and being a part of and not feeling othered. And this is something that I've said also in previous presentations that I've done, that when I moved to Canada, I became Black, whereas when I was in Jamaica, that wasn't really even a concept that existed. And so when I got to university, in my second year, I founded this service called RAISE, which what it does is to address racism and xenophobia on campus. It was an uphill battle trying to get our university to even acknowledge that racism was a problem and that Black students were being disproportionately and very violently affected by a lot of the ways that anti-Black racism becomes present in the academic space. So that's a little bit of background about me. I started getting more involved in organizing in Toronto when I was there for 2 co-op terms, and it's just a very natural part of my life just to speak up against things that are wrong. And also I get paid to do that now, which is really nice. Being able to work at my university as someone that is like actively speaking up against like anti-Black racism, homophobia specifically, as like a Black queer person, going back to what Yaz was saying earlier, just about like how like parts of your identity, can like overlap to create a very specific experience. So that's kind of it. So when it came to integrating this like practice into my work, it felt very natural and very obvious to me. But again, like this is like coming as like a young Black like queer woman that moved to Canada and like is an immigrant. So I'm like, okay, what's my story with it? It's kind of just always been a part of the way that I organize. When I was a part of the Black Student Association, I was the only out queer person at the time. So it was like very obvious to me that like, you know, when you're in a specific space, that there are going to be, again, identities or like layers of people that interact differently in the space. And I don't want to get too much into like homophobia in Black communities, but so integrating like anti-oppression for me just meant making sure that like I was paying attention to like whoever came into the space. So if there was someone that might have like a very like a disability or maybe an invisible like disability, I would make sure to like, you know, like cater the space like towards them in terms of like, okay, like hi, like, you know, participating, allowing them to like speak, paying special attention to them when they spoke. And these are like really small things, but I find that they are really important when it comes to community organizing and like who gets to feel welcome where. So paying attention to them when they speak. I'm like so excited. I'm like talking over my words. But yeah, like paying attention to them when they speak, just like allowing them to like recentering the focus of a conversation on them when they get spoken over, which is just like a very natural thing that happens in community spaces. And on top of that, so that's on an interpersonal level. On an institutional level, a lot of that work just looks like going to meetings with like, in my case, like university admin, like really like high level people, and just like talking very plainly about what it is that students are experiencing, and just being like, Black students, this is the day-to-day, like this is what Black students are experiencing, this is what like Indigenous students on campus are experiencing, and just like using my like position that I have right now for the time being as an opportunity to just like really make it very obvious through like anecdote and through story. Like storytelling is also a very important tool for my like anti-oppression work, I guess, because there's something to be said about using story and which is very common for like Black and Indigenous people, as a way to validate or more like communicate things about our day-to-day and lived experiences. So that's like a bit, like I could really go on and on and on about this, and just like all the different types of things that I do, even when it comes to some organizing that Yaz and I have done together. Like anti-oppression is just, it's like the way to go. Like I can't imagine community organizing happening any other way, or like community organizing that is useful and like, again, as Yas said, just like that lends to the future that we want to create, just being empathetic to like people around us and really just considering like what different people's experiences could be like. So that's me. Is that good? Was that good? That was good.
Yeah. Thanks, Vic. That's great. And yeah, I'll just flag that we're going to get a bit deeper into these sharings in our breakout that will be happening slightly later. But yeah, that was really great. And you really highlighted the ways in which like, yeah, anti-oppression work really has to be integrated into all of the work that we do and the way when we show up. So yeah, really grateful for that. Thank you. Yeah, I'll invite Cass to share next. Yeah, welcome, Cass.
Hi everyone, I'm Cass. I use they, them pronouns, and I am in the city named Quesnel, British Columbia, the traditional territory of the Lataco Dene Nation. So for me, anti-oppression work means disabling systems that have been built to marginalize and discriminate against particular groups. So from an LGBTQ2S+ perspective, anti-oppression means holding space and educating individuals about our silenced identities. It's important to keep in mind that there are many intersectional identities, whether they're within or outside of the LGBTQ2S+ community. So glowing examples of anti-oppression work by those with intersecting identities are the Stonewall riots and subsequent Pride parades, which were started by Black trans women 50 years ago. So allyship is lifelong work and is a healthy balance of action and inaction. As a white person, I try to use my privilege to amplify Indigenous and Black voices while also advocating and peacefully protesting alongside marginalized people. I started my anti-oppression work and allyship by doing some self-reflection and seeking to understand where my implicit biases are rooted. I did a lot of unlearning and reevaluating to align my anti-oppression values and beliefs. And when I have the knowledge to educate myself, I can begin to educate others. I started having difficult conversations with loved ones about their racism and sexism, and then moved to local politicians to discuss classism. I took the time to listen to how the Two-Spirit community was erased by colonialism and racism for centuries, and how vital these intersecting identities are to Indigenous communities. And much like Indigenous communities being underfunded, rural communities with LGBTQ2S+ agencies are often overlooked and dismissed. Most funders expect a high quantity of people being served rather than the quality of work that we are doing within the community. I have always lived in rural towns in British Columbia, all of which have conservative ideations. However, contrary to what we see in the media, I have seen a lot of support from local businesses and societies, but it has taken decades to get to where we are now, and we have anti-oppression advocates to thank for that. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much it for me. I was invited to this to talk a little bit about my work with the local Pride Society. I am the president, and I have my social work degree, and I get paid to be a victim services worker. So that is, yeah, I'm not really sure what else to say. I think that's it.
Yeah, thank you, Cass. Yeah, that was a really important reflection, especially in regards to, like, again, like the intersections of queer communities and how so many BIPOC folks within those spaces have been erased and disproportionately affected by like anti-queer sentiment. So thank you for sharing. And yeah, our next guest is Hannah, and I'm really excited to hear their reflection. So Hannah, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Yaz, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this amazing panel. It's an honor to share space with all of you. And similar to Cass, I'm going to talk a little bit about allyship. So as Yaz mentioned, I'm the executive director of the 10 Oaks Project, which is a charity that engages and connects children and youth from 2S LGBTQ+ identities, families, and communities. And so I've been doing this work for about 10 years, and I spend my days thinking about power and privilege and plays out and how it gets internalized is just embedded in the structures that make up our lives. And so the whole point of the programs that I run, which are mostly summer camp programs, but we also do some year-round stuff too. But the whole point is to create spaces where kids can be with people who are like them and who have shared identities and experiences and who they don't need to explain themselves to or come out to, and have it be a huge, nerve-wracking, terrifying thing. They've all experienced being outsiders, being the only one in different spaces and not being represented in the mainstream. And it's a lovely, beautiful, magical place. And there is still a huge need for everybody to be practicing allyship in my programs. Just because the space is filled with 2S LGBTQ people does not mean by far that it is free of oppression. It doesn't mean that we automatically sort of get every single element of each other in our experiences. There's still absolutely racism, transmisogyny, ableism, transphobia, classism, and so many forms of oppression and discrimination that play out because we're all products of the worlds we live in and we're raised in and learned in. And my programs in particular, they don't happen in a vacuum. And I would guess that most of yours don't either. And that's where allyship and working in solidarity with folks who we don't share identities with comes in. So I'm queer, I'm white, middle class, able-bodied, university-educated, cisgender woman who is also a settler on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory. And I have been the target of homophobia and sexism and misogyny and relational violence. But that doesn't mean that I know what it's like to be Black or to be trans by far. And I don't know what it's like to live in a body that doesn't look and function exactly as my own does because this is the only one I've got. And no single person in the programs that I run knows what it's like to experience all of the incredible identities or the hardships rooted in oppression that make up our communities. So I could talk about allyship for hours, but I will not. But I want to share a few of the key things I've learned over the years of doing this work. And I also want to say that I'm by no means an expert in this at all. This has been through trial and error, and there will be plenty more of that for me and for all of us. So the first thing, and what I would argue is almost one of the main things, is allyship is a verb. It's not a noun. So it's not a title that you get to give yourself or something that you achieve after attending a workshop or whatnot. It's a thing you have to practice day in and day out. You know, there's no, do 9 acts of allyship and get 1 free punch card. So you might have done amazing allyship work for 10 years, and that doesn't get you off the hook from having to continue to do it each and every day over and over again. The second thing is that you will make mistakes in your allyship work and you will hurt people, and you have to keep going and not freeze in fear when that happens. Lately, I've heard from so many folks, especially white folks, given anti-Black racism actions around the world, that they don't know where to start, that they're afraid to post anything on their social media, and they're afraid to even check in on their Black friends because they're afraid they'll do it wrong. And a big part of that fear is coming from a really good place. So they're worried about doing more harm to individuals and communities who are already very raw and in pain. And also, some of that fear is coming from a self-protective place of being super uncomfortable with making mistakes, with potentially being called out or challenged, and with looking like anything but the most knowledgeable person out there. And we should always approach ally and solidarity work with the overarching goal of causing as little harm as possible. But we will inevitably hurt each other, and not by intent, but because we've all grown up in systems that protect and promote white supremacy. They center straight and cis people, and they aim to take down anyone and anything that challenges this. And this stuff is so deeply ingrained in each and every one of us, it's really hard to unlearn. And it's even harder to unlearn when we're avoiding it, which is what we're doing, essentially, when we freeze in fear. Allyship is not about being perfect, but about owning it when we make mistakes, when we hurt people, and it's about learning to be accountable and apologizing and working to repair when we do screw up. The next sort of key point I have is that repression is only possible when you hold privilege. So when the pandemic hit back in March, I had to get off Facebook. It was just a deluge of news and panic about COVID-19, and it was way too much for my mental health and my anxiety. I was just off the charts anxious. But Facebook is also historically where I've gotten a lot of information about what's happening in the world that's not shared on mainstream news sources. And it's also where I've read and engaged in really nuanced conversations around ally work. So when I left social media, I had to choose how to still engage, because I did need to engage in some ways. And I also had to add a bunch of new sources of places to get information to my days so that I could still be looped into this work. Because in the past, I have absolutely been guilty of, scrolling past conversations about transphobia or about racism, because I didn't feel able to engage with them and felt totally overwhelmed. And I argued in my head that it was for my mental health that I was opting out of these things. And that's valid, but as people doing allyship work, we have a responsibility to engage even when it's hard, because people facing the actual oppression don't get to scroll past. It's their lives, day in, day out, whether they have the capacity to engage with it or not. The next thing I would share, which seems like an obvious one, but it's really complicated one, is that when somebody tells you that they're experiencing oppression that you can't personally experience because of your identity, you need to listen. So even if you don't understand, even if your gut reaction is to disagree or to try and soothe them and say, no, I'm sure it wasn't, rooted in transphobia. You're there to listen, to empathize, to create space for rage and pain and grief. And it's an honor that they're sharing this with you. And it's not your job to be the oppression detective or to jump in and try and soothe these particular feelings. I think one of the really important things about being an ally is finding who your people are, who you can be fragile with in this process. So the other day, one of my colleagues texted me and said, do you have a minute to chat? I just got some feedback from a staff member and I'm feeling some white fragility. So we got on the phone and we talked about it, and there's some tears and some frustration and some sadness, and then some action planning for how to move forward and better work in solidarity. And that was totally appropriate because both my colleague and I are white. What would not have been okay was my colleague having the same conversation with a BIPOC staff member who gave the feedback. That staff member is already carrying so many things that we white folks can't even begin to imagine, and should not have to hold our hands as we process and have our feelings about it. I would also caution against performative allyship. So a lot of allyship is performance. So it's, things like white-led companies who make and sell and profit off of a line of clothing that has the Black Lives Matter hashtag. But they do nothing to address why there are very few Black folks working for them, or what even gives them the right to make those t-shirts and use that slogan. It's, performance is the person who shows up at a march for trans rights and, takes the photos with them of the sign, they post them on social media, but then they don't show up for the trans folks in their lives. Those actions are pretty meaningless when they're not backed up by other things, by quiet allyship, by allyship that maybe nobody ever knows about. And then the final thing I share is that this work is not about what you personally get out of it. So if you're doing this work to get public or private recognition or warm, fuzzy feelings from others for being an ally, those aren't the right reasons. And I love this quote from the blog, "The body's not an apology." And it says, a lot of these activists complain that people of color aren't immediately excited or warm to them in activist spaces. People working in solidarity understand that we carry the history of white supremacy in our bodies and our faces. There's no reason on earth to trust white peers in racial justice work. There are no cookies for showing up. We may not get invited to the celebration party afterwards, where our peers of color might need a POC-only space to download and support each other. The reward is the opportunity to do something meaningful to counter a violent order that was built to serve our interests. And so I wanted to end my comments here with the words of one of my favorite poets, Nyira Wahid, who wrote, "Decolonization requires acknowledging that your needs and desires should never come at the expense of another's life energy. It is being honest that you've been spoiled by a machine that is not feeding your freedom, but feeding you the milk of pain." And that honesty, I think, is really at the core and the beginning of allyship work. So thank you very much, and back to you, Yas.
Oops, sorry. Oh, hello. Sorry. Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, I think that was an important like reflection in regards to allyship. I also, really, I think allyship is really complicated, and I think that's why I'm glad we're having these breakouts, because there's a lot there to unpack in what you said. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I just have a few things to add to just like after like listening to you, Hannah, like I want to be like also like very intentional about this, that like while it might seem like, you know, very like natural to say like, oh, like, you know, we're all gonna hurt each other. Well, like the truth is that like white people are perpetuating like a lot of harm like in these spaces, and are typically the people that perpetrate like harm in these spaces. And like, so from there to like, you know, try to say, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't say anything. Well, that's like violence. Like silence is violence. Like the inability to speak up about what, like in this specific instance, like Black people are experiencing, is only as a result of white supremacy. Like you're only afforded silence because of white supremacy. If I don't say anything, I'm gonna be dead. Like if I don't say anything, like the other people in my community like won't have food on their table. So it's very convenient to say, oh well, like, you know, like you just don't want to say the wrong thing. Like then like do something. Like if you're worried about like what you're saying, then like do something, like donate, like actually get out there, like pick up a book and read it. Because like otherwise like it kind of just puts like Black people and other people of color and like other people that are marginalized in the spot where they feel like they kind of have to walk people through the nitty gritty of like organizing and activism, when my day to day is already hard. So I think that that's also just something to be aware of. And just like another thing is that like, although, and we can all say that it is white people's responsibility to like collaborate or to work on ridding the world of like racism and the other impacts of colonialism and white supremacy, white people are also not the stewards of this work. Like white people do not allow Black people and other racialized and marginalized people to be or say or do anything. Like we do these things because our survival like depends on it. And like, yes, like white people should be just silent and listen, but like this work is not like, white people don't allow us to do this work. We've had to do this work because of white people, and like as a result of whiteness and all the different ways that white supremacy has like materialized in so many different ways. Even a lot of like what we would say is queerphobia or transphobia have like really, really strong connections to white supremacy and colonialism, particularly for like groups like Black people. Being Jamaican, like I can definitely see, and there's like historic like relationship between like queerphobia and colonialism. So like I just like want to be like super clear like about that, and just like make sure that we're being like super like speaking truth to power about what it is like this like anti-oppressive work is and how it takes place, and to make sure that like people are safe in doing this work, and that marginalized people don't have to like consistently be like going up and trying to explain and trying to like hold space for like white people, when like ultimately like my livelihood and like my community's like existence depends on this work. So like centering other people's comfort is just not like, it's kind of just like what did it say, like should or get off the pot, like it's that kind of thing. So yeah, that's all I had to say. Yes, thank you for allowing me to speak.
Yeah, thanks, Vic. I think those are really important reflections. And again, I think like I was just saying, allyship is something right now that it's especially being grappled with, and how that looks and what that means. And I think that was a really important foundational reflection that you shared in regards to the ways in which like allyship can mimic like white saviorism, right? And wanting to really name that and speak to that. So thank you for that. And I think that was a really good, like, I think this back and forth is a really nice way to kind of set the groundwork for conversations that we want to dig into now. So it's not going to be complicated because Zoom is kind of weird, but we're going to do a breakout session. And the way in which that's going to work is we're going to have two conversations. one, to again dig deeper into this conversation we've just been having, which is around like what is meaningful allyship and solidarity, and the other is like how to engage in like equitable spaces and continue to do this work and show up. So the way in which this is going to work is we're going to send everyone to a breakout room. So in that breakout room, if you want to stay a part of the conversation about equitable spaces, then you'll stay in the breakout room. And then if you would like to be a part of the meaningful allyship conversation, then you're going to leave the breakout room and come back. I'll repeat that once we're all in the breakout room because it'll be easier, and I'll just be like, leave if you want to go here. But yeah, so everyone's going to be sent to this breakout room. So get ready for that. And yeah, I'm really excited to like dig deeper into these reflections. Yeah.
Great. So yes, I have the breakout room set up. So yeah, if you're we're all gonna go there together. We're all gonna go on a virtual journey to the breakout room. And then some of us may come back to this group here. Remind us before we do that, how much time we have for this breakout, because we're wrapping up at 4 o'clock, and then we have a half hour for sharing circle. So we're spending about 20 minutes in the breakout?
Yeah, we're here until 3:45, so 15, just over 15. Yep. Okay,
perfect. Okay, so I'm gonna do the Zoom wizardry to create the breakouts, and then we're good to go. So we'll see you all in the breakout room right now.
Thanks.
Hello, hello.
Hello. And we're all back, so.
Hi.
Hello. So.
I think there's a few more people coming in.
Yeah, there's a few.
Just a note too that we are not going to be recording the breakout conversation. Yes. So this will be a space where people can share a little freely and not have reflections saved on the internet.
Again, from the other group as well. There were things that didn't get answered yet. Yes, I saw that. Thank you. Okay. I think this is about everyone. So yeah, thank you everyone for engaging in those conversations. A lot of this is difficult, but it's really important to be talking about. Again, no matter how long a breakout session is, they never feel long enough. So that's why we kind of welcomed everyone back into the big group to kind of maybe share some reflections that either we didn't get to in the smaller breakouts, or a really important one. We're like, everyone must know this fact that we just came up with. Yeah, so I just want to name that in our breakout group, we had a few folks who had some like questions that might be useful to go through as a group. Lee, was there anyone in your group that we wanted to like also highlight before, like, just so I can keep a radar on that?
Go through. I don't think we wanted to fill out a little bit more talking about tokenism, and then we have a comment in the chat from I'm going to pronounce it Jacobet, or I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, has something that they would like to share as well.
Okay,
so yeah, Vic and Cass did a great job talking about a little bit about tokenism, allyship, and how do we show up in communities. But I think we're curious to hear from your group and then see where we land.
Great. Okay. Also recognizing it's 3:55. I think those are really fruitful conversations. We're going to try and have this conversation and reflections from both groups. So if folks can keep their reflections, like, don't want to cut anyone off, but just like keep them shorter, but we can also go into a bit of that, that reflection circle time if you have the ability to stay. But I'll start with Marika because they had something to share, or she had something to share.
I just actually had another question, and through this session, I've been reflecting a lot because for me, something that I've been struggling with recently, and this, I really resonated with what Hannah was sharing in her original introduction, was I've been feeling really overwhelmed by social media and the conversations going on social media, particularly because it's not a very safe space to have a conversation. And a lot of the people that are engaging in dialogue on social media don't have like anti-oppression awareness and don't know how, and they all come with their own projections and are constantly, and if you are coming forward with something that's not like the popular opinion, you get attacked and like picked apart. And and trying to keep up with that and engage in that sort of dialogue, I find to be really draining. And it's actually, I really enjoy engaging in these kinds of conversations in the everyday world, because it's not like that as it is online. You're having human to human interactions, and you can judge that level of people can be more sensitive towards one another. So I guess what I'm looking for in this question is, does anyone have any advice or ideas for how to create, I guess, healthy boundaries around engaging in social media, and how to do so in a way that's not gonna suck all the life out of you?
May I respond? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
What I've found with social media is that people have a false sense of bravado, and that you'll get not even necessarily how they really feel, but you'll get a very aggressive stance by some people. And I've just stopped having those kind of conversations over social media, because I found that you get people that are just enjoy trying to engage in a negative conversation. So that would be my opinion, or my experience with that.
And that's actually been my approach for the past few weeks or so. I've been kind of taking a breather from engaging in social media, but then I'm also afraid, like, is this my white privilege, that's allowing me to not engage in this? Like, is engaging in these conversations in my everyday life enough, or should I be is it my role and my job to invest this extra energy because of someone who's benefited from white privilege my whole life?
And I don't mean I don't engage in Facebook. I put positive messages. I put messages that I believe should be out there, but I don't respond to the negative. So I don't engage that. But I'm constantly putting positive fodder on there to have people engage with. And I think that's part of my responsibility. But I won't engage with the negative, because it just seems like it's not even, I've known people that in person would never talk like that to me. But on Facebook, they've got lots to say, and it's just doesn't feel like it deserves to have my attention, because I'm not even sure how real it is, and I don't want to encourage that kind of negative platform. So that's just, I do put positive messages out, and I'll engage that way. But if I find people are being slanderous or rude, I'll just say, I will not engage in this conversation, and I'll cut it off.
Yeah, thank you. I think the last reflection I would just share about that is just making sure that sometimes it is really important to engage with negative feedback, just because, especially if you're moving from a place of privilege, because you probably won't get affected by that harm the same way that someone who would be facing that oppression would. So sometimes it is really important to hold other folks accountable. So with social media, something I've been doing is just kind of finding a balance of sharing and engaging, but then also making sure to engage in self-care. And this obviously looks different for different folks in the way in which oppression affects you, but just making sure you're checking in on yourself and your community, but also showing up, right? And I think that's just important reflection. But I also want to get to some other folks, recognizing it's 4:00. So just wanted to say, if folks have to leave, we're just really, really grateful for you engaging in this session with us. I think we're having some really important conversations, and this always happens when it comes to reflections, always at the very end, when everything pops up. But just wanted to remind folks we have an extra 30 minutes going on. Hopefully we'll get a bit of a healing session, but we can engage a little bit longer in this conversation if you are able to stay. I think Jacob had to go. If you're still here and want to share a reflection. Sorry if I mispronounced your name also.
I think they had to step off, I think.
Oh,
at 4.
darn. Okay, sorry, apologies. Okay.
But I think Vic had their hand up as well.
Yeah, sure.
Yes. So what I was going to say to, I'm if it's Marika. Okay, all right, thank you. Or yeah. So one thing that I would say about that and like people reacting negatively is like also you have like all the power in the world to change your relationship with like what it is that you're doing on social media. For example, like, you know, you find that these things are very like essential to your learning, or like it's very practical for you to be continuously having conversations. Well, like, you know, you can, at least when it comes to social media, you can just make that relationship. I'll just come on here to read, like I'll just see what people are saying, like, and chances are the conversation that you're trying to have has already been had in like 10 different ways. And so like just like sometimes doing your research and just like seeing like what conversation is already out there, and that can like minimize like your own sort of like well-being in terms of like not wanting to like engage in a space like that. So like I would say like, yeah, going on like following like a few people that are like engaged in this work, and like just like seeing what conversations like come up there, what resources they share, like what books there's so many reading lists on the internet right now, like going through the reading list. And like if you can join a book club right now, I think their ad is like you are like letter U letter R doing great on Instagram is doing a book club on, I think, Our Prison's Obsolete. Yes, yeah, Our Prison's Obsolete, which is like right now we're having a lot of conversation on like defunding police. Like a lot of people will be sharing lots of information there, and so you can like you do have like autonomy in how you engage in that conversation, and you don't necessarily have to be like going out and asking. So yeah.
Thank you, Vic. Just wanted to get to if there's any reflections that the folks in the other breakout wanted to share in regards to like the tokenism and like how we show up in these spaces. Yeah, just would invite that if anyone wants to share.
Vic did a great job just of sharing some of the things around like making sure that we listen. It's not enough to just have representation on our teams, but like, you know, and I think for me that was the thing that I took away the most from that conversation was like, are we actually going to implement the things that people of, you know, and Vic, I'm paraphrasing, I'm just in remind, if I say it incorrectly, please correct me. But the notion of like, if you're bringing in people or people that who have different experience than you, there's one thing to just sort of have someone there to have their face and have that visibility and that diversity. But if you're not actually implementing the things that they're asking for, that's actually the challenge of tokenism is like, I'm here, but you're not listening. And not actually taking action on the things that we're actually representing. That's when we move away from tokenism and doing that work. And I want to thank you, Vic, for that reflection, because it was really kind of like, it was raw and it was real. And I think it really it hit me really good. So thank you for that.
No problem.
Great. If there's any other reflections, maybe we'll make room for one more and then we can transition into the next phase of our session. Yeah.
And we'll do the last reflection and then I'll stop the recording because we'll do the closing circle in that way. But thanks everyone who's sticking around for this extra time.
Really grateful.
Also, there's the requisite shout out to Adrienne Marie Brown came out in our session as well. Emergent Strategy came up. So obviously that is a book that everyone should throw on their reading list as well. She's got it right there. And my copy is dog-eared and highlighted as well.
Maybe a last reflection would be just sharing kind of what we went through in our breakout. A really important question was raised a few times, just about how we approach, like how white folks can approach other white folks who are doing a lot of harm, and like wanting to approach it with a lot of aggression, and wanting to approach it with like the passion and like confront that. And just something that we talked about, and Hannah shared something really beautiful, so we'll welcome you to share this, but after, just quickly, was just reminding folks that like the way in which you show up is it as like an ally, or as a white person to another white person, or as like a straight person or cis person to another straight or cis person, is just making sure that you realize who's around you, because sometimes for example, at a protest, and I shared this in the last group, at like a Black Lives Matter protest, if you are engaging with counter protesters with a lot of passion and aggression, that often will put the larger group, which is usually Black folks, in all their intersections, at greater harm and risk. So it's really important to remember you have, like, as Hannah said, like a bunch of ways in which we can approach and confront any of the harmful things that people say. It is really important to remember that, as much as these stances can feel like they're not changing, and like people are set in their ways, like Vic just shared, like we are seeing so much transformative justice and like societal transformation in this moment. So it's just important to keep engaging, and like, again, community care is a really big thing. So making sure you have folks to lean on if you had a really like a really impactful conversation, or something that you took away some exhaustion from. And just leaning on like the toolbox of like how we can approach folks in different positions. And someone shared like, just like the way you approach a family versus someone on the street, it depends on the context. But Hannah, is there anything else you wanted to share, or anyone from that breakout, is like the last reflection in regards to this context?
I think you got it. I think I just mentioned it's useful to have a diversity of tactics in your toolbox to use depending on the situation and the person, and you'll get a feeling if it's somebody you know well, what tactic is perhaps more likely to resonate or to work well or to de-escalate or whatever. But it is harder with strangers for sure, and that's where you have to sort of look around at where you're at and who's most likely to come to harm because of whatever tactic you're choosing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, this was a really like heavy conversation, and we've been holding a lot on top of what like we're all holding in the world right now. So again, just want to thank everyone for showing up today and showing up authentically and being brave in this space to ask questions. I think it's really important that we kind of ask these questions in spaces like this and in smaller groups, so that we can actually address oppression and like racism and homophobia and transphobia in like the real world, outside of these like very confined sessions, in a more in a more helpful and impactful way. So just really grateful for that. I think what would make sense is, this has been heavy. So we're going to transition into a like healing and reflection circle. Obviously we're on Zoom, so it's not really a circle, but just a space. Would give folks maybe a 2-minute break, because again, like this has been a lot. So if you're deciding to share and stay with us for the last half hour, so we're going to go until 4:30, so really 20 minutes. Would just invite you to take 2 minutes just to like decompress for a second. You can turn off your cameras, and we'll come back at 4:12. If this is all you're joining us for today, really grateful for it. And we hope to see you in upcoming sessions. If anyone else wants to say anything in their goodbyes, just feeling a lot of gratitude. So thank you. Great. And so we'll return if you want to come back for that in 2 minutes at 4:12.